It came up when I had this radio discussion. Is that there was this notion that, oh, Muslim countries need to apologize for the Barbary coast slavery. There's issue with that. First of all, is that which is that who's going to apologize for that? Because the country, because the kingdoms or the entities who ruled those regions now were not the same entities who ruled them then. There are probably 5 or 6 instances in history, in the history of the Muslim lands, which are really questionable and were really kind of abuses of not only the Sharia. It was all based upon greed and their own rapacious tendencies and so forth, and ignorance of Islam. But these things happen. Many of the Muslims of North Africa were involved in, and it's known as galley slavery. So it's essentially there was piracy where Muslims would kind of raid the coasts of southern Spain, southern Italy, and actually there's even evidence of that it happened in Ireland as well.
I heard, yes.
They
yes.
raid the coastlines, kind of take spoils, and goods and items and people as well. And I think and colonialism led to kind of a complete kind of for some Muslim countries, complete kind of severance from the past, from the lands which they were in as well. So and I think that's really key. It's not necessarily going to be the case that people are going to be aware of some of these things which happened in the past, but it's important for us to know as Muslims. Why? Because if we don't know about it, but if we're not the ones who kind of are the ones who kind of are discussing it and talking about it and also exposing it, then not only are we not going to learn from the past, but also we're leaving the door open for us to be really severely criticized.
But what would you say, Ustad, to those who say that this history is divisive? Is this potentially harmful for the global state of the Muslims today, for their unity? And we have other priorities that should actually occupy our time, not talking about the past.
Aspect you can't say we shouldn't talk about the past all the time, because as I said, and as the historians in the past mentioned, like Suyuti and others, you have to learn from the mistakes of what happened in the past. Whether we are aware of it or not, it's good for us to know. Why? Because if we don't know about it, someone's going to come and start raising it and say, look, look at these people talking about Islam, but this is what happened in their past, and they're not even assessing it.
SubhanAllah.
So I think that's key as well. We need to kind of be aware of it. It's true, but it's not that we go on and on about it, but definitely kind of need to be aware of where grave mistakes happened in the past, and where there was kind of very questionable things which happened in the past, and then also a complete contravention of the divine legislation.
And is it okay, would you say? Do you think would you encourage people to have that, as you mentioned, very critical, very accountable approach to history, to say, listen, we made an error, or that was not right? I prefer personally somebody to give me the full information, to tell me, actually, this is the information, but you know what? That does not comply to the principles of Islam. Yes, Muslims are behind it, but it's not Islamic in that sense. But I'm not going to hide it for fear of somehow giving an upper hand for somebody else, because eventually what will happen, it'll come out anyway.
In 2007, I was called on a Christian radio show. I think that show is actually online on YouTube actually now. I think it's 2007. That someone contacted me. There were some of the research which I've been doing in this regard. So I was contacted by this Christian radio show to come and discuss about should the Muslim world apologize for slavery.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a great one.
So before I attended, I spoke to some of the brothers about how to approach that. Yeah, some of the good brothers who were kind of involved in sort of dawah in London at the time. Some of my good brothers like 𝗲𝗄𝗏 and Isa Khalist. And one of the things that we kind of discussed, no, hold on, let's actually say no. It's actually no. Anyone who was involved in that, yeah, in that sort of slavery and contravening Sharia, and even maybe in some cases denying, parts of the Quran and things like the Prophet said about treating slaves. Yeah, those people, yeah, they do need to issue an apology. So when I actually entered that show, I sort of threw them off. I threw them because I think they were expecting me not to say that people who that obviously the thing was that obviously those people who were involved in it, they're no longer here.
Yeah.
but obviously anyone who's kind of is involved in that, advocating that, contravening the Sharia, and these kind of things, obviously those people, yeah, they they do need to apologize if they have rejected what Islam says about sort of how slaves should be treated and what the rulings are with regards to slavery. Then yeah, then of course they need to, and that would totally threw these Christians off. They wasn't expecting that. And so I think it's really, so that's why it shows that it's important that we do kind of comprehend some of these things which happen in history. And I would say, Ustad Ibrahim, there are probably 5 or 6 instances in history in the in the history of the Muslim lands which are really questionable and were really kind of abuses of not only the Sharia. Obviously, they were not people. The people who were doing these abuses were not actually they're not religious people, not practicing Muslims. You know, it was all based upon greed and their own rapacious tendencies and so forth, and ignorance of Islam. But these things happen. Ignorant Muslims did things. Did they necessarily do things in the name of Islam? That's another thing. Obviously, we know that some did, but we find there's some examples of there's some instances of slavery in the Muslim realm, which definitely are worth exploring and worth us kind of highlighting. The first one is what is known as the Zand Rebellion, what happened in Basra in the
Yes.
9th century Christian era. So it's talking about maybe 250 years after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
That what happened in the in Iraq was that there was more greater use of plantation-based slavery systems. That came to be something which came to be used, and that led to a huge influx of East African slaves who are working in parts of Iraq. Interestingly, in Iraq to this day, they do actually have like a community, communities who are actually of African origin, and I'm not whether some of them are from that particular epoch. I'm not sure, but maybe some of them are actually do descend from that particular epoch. Um, but there was a rebellion which is known as the Zand Rebellion, which was basically like a sort of slave revolt. It wasn't just a slave revolt as well. There were some other people who led that as well, who had other political interests as well, who kind of used maybe the slaves as a kind of a rallying point. But that did happen as well. So that was with regards to the well-known Zand Rebellion of Basra, which is well known. That's quite well documented. But if you read like uh, the Tarikh of Ibn Kathir, he gives more kind of sheds more light in terms of some of the individuals and personalities who are also involved in kind of spurring that on that particular revolt. But that's really interesting because what some of the historians say as well is that after that revolt, there wasn't really, you didn't find it in the Middle East large scale plantation based slavery.
Mm.
That didn't happen after that particular experience. Um, Now, in terms of um, other parts of Africa, we have, if we look at it chronologically, we have in the sort of 16th century, 15th, 16th century, there was what was known as the slavery of the Barbary Coast slavery, which was kind of like largely centered around sort of um, Algiers at the time, and some of that was kind of essentially that was kind of like a type of piracy where they were kind of like Muslim uh, pirates who not necessarily acting in the name of the kind of state at the time per se, but there was a lot of kind of, but I mean, it happened. It was kind of a bit, it's like tit for tat, that kind of galley slavery. But I mean, it was something which many of the Muslims of North Africa were involved in. And this guy was it's known as galley slavery. So it's essentially there was piracy where Muslims would kind of raid the coasts of southern Spain, southern Italy, and actually there's even evidence as well that it happened in actually in Ireland as well.
I heard, yes,
They'd
yes.
raid the coastlines, kind of take spoils, and goods and items and people as well. I mean, it was interesting, kind of. I mean, there's an excellent book by Robert C. Davis, who wrote a book called Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, and I mean, superb book where he goes into this in really great detail. Probably the best, I'd say, probably I venture to say, probably the best, one of the best books on the topic. And he also discusses as well that kind of slave or that kind of piracy and corsair slave, they were corsairs, that kind of corsair raiding was also, I mean, there were people kind of in the sort of the Christian realm who were doing that as well. But what's something which was really kind of big in North Africa. And what was interesting about in that in terms of the relationship is and that's why I was actually it came up when I had this radio discussion is that there was this notion that Muslim countries need to apologize for Barbary coast slavery. Now there's issue with that. First of all, is that I first heard that used by Nick Griffin, who used to be the former head of the
Oh
BNP.
yes,
He tried to
yes.
say that, and then you had other kind of evangelical English Christians were trying to say that as well. But there's a huge problem with that because of what I just alluded to earlier, Ustad Ibrahim, which is that who's going to apologize for that? Because the country, because the kingdoms or the entities who ruled those regions now were not the same entities who ruled them then. In fact, they were actually maybe in some cases they had maybe in some cases there were uh controversies and disputes over the throne in some of those countries. So how can a kind of you see what I'm saying? You see the difficulty in trying to say that a country now should apologize for something which happened in the past. It's quite difficult. Although I do think that there can be scope for kind of there is scope for kind of understanding and even where there is cases for due justice to be made. I do believe that but it's still hard to say why should a particular entity now apologize for something which in the past maybe the ancestors of those people involved in that, but also against my ancestors.
Let
So
me.
how can I you see it's quite difficult.
That brings me to a very important question. So in that case, if we take that reasoning, should we expect the descendants of those Europeans who enslaved West African Muslims, for example, to give forms of reparation or forms of apology to acknowledge the horrific slave trade that actually spanned over 4 centuries, and resulted in what we see in the Americas today? Because that's the same kind of logic, isn't it? Someone may say,
I say the logic's slightly different, Ustad Ibrahim, because if someone had gained like all the the main their main assets, their main wealth was based upon slavery, and that's what your kind of forebears, which are quite not that long ago, sort of forebears, could be traced to that kind of industry, that kind of industry and that kind of production. That's a bit different from kind of like the Barbary slavery though. Because remember, Barbary slavery was more, as I said, it was slightly of a tit for tat corsair piracy. It wasn't something where there was an economic benefit. And interesting in the Barbary coast slavery of Saud Ibrahim was that many of the people could often go back to Europe. That couldn't happen in transatlantic slavery. That didn't happen there,
so
or
in
very
terms of
rarely, or very rarely. Very rarely that did. Obviously, we had cases, like where people
this
did go back to
way, exactly,
Liberia
I
and so
would say,
forth,
yeah.
but and Sierra Leone. But very rarely, generally that did not really kind of happen en masse. Whereas in the Corsair Barbary slavery, it wasn't really with an economic sort of like aim in mind. It was it was more of a kind of due to the tensions after 1492, the tensions between North Africa and between southern Spain and the kind of Christendom was quite intense. So due to it was kind of as I said, kind of a tit for tat Barbary. Although at the same time, I've read in the books like Robert C. Davis mentions in his book some of the accounts of some of the English people, for instance, who experienced galley slavery, and obviously very horrific, nothing to do, Islam doesn't justify that, totally against Islam. But there was a huge difference between that kind of because, and as I said, you're not finding the descendants of Barbary slaves, that they have either have include some kind of either economic detriment or which you find it when it comes to kind of West African stuff. You do find, and people of African diaspora, there has been a clear kind of material disadvantage which those descendants have faced, which you don't. That's not happening because in Barbary Corsair slavery, people are kind of were freed, and in
I
fact,
think
this is Robert C. Davis mentions this in his book that sometimes there were petitions which people would send from England to Algeria to the ruling Bey of Algeria at the time, and then those people were subsequently released.
There are so many things I want to say right now. Honestly, I think it's just an amazing discussion today. We have to have a part two. We must have a part two because it's barely scratching the surface of such a very profound topic. But I live on this cliffhanger. Yeah, so maybe the Barbary slave trade was not to the same magnitude and level as what we've seen in the transatlantic slavery, but we mustn't forget we also had the East African slavery, which was certainly of a greater magnitude. And in fact, one of the chief arguments that those who seek to explain why America shouldn't apologize is that at least the slaves who were taken to the Americas are still visible today. We can still see the descendants because they were allowed to have children, whereas those who were taken through the East African ports to the Arabian regions were castrated, so they couldn't even, there's no way of seeing the result of that slavery today. They were castrated, so that certainly would have been a worse form of slavery, and there are documentations. So I would really love for us to have a part two on this one, because I think it's very difficult.
I think with regards to what you just mentioned, you do still find though huge communities of people of African descent. You do find them in this country, whether they're known about or not is another thing. There's someone who's a really interesting YouTuber called the Visual Poet.
Yes,
And
I've seen it.
He went to he went to, I think, to Pakistan. He met the communities there.
It is.
And the Shidi communities there. So there are communities, and also like in Oman, huge
A lot,
kind
yes.
of community. I mean, there's a huge community.
There's in Yemen as well, the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, but they treated very badly al-𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Yemen.
So there are communities. In terms of what you alluded to with the castration, we will discuss that, I think, forthcoming, because that's quite a big and substantial segment which does need to be covered. And that was used more so in kind of the Ottoman realm.
There is that as well. But there is a lot of evidence that in North Africa, there's so much. I mean, we have to have another part, inshallah. But again, thank you for taking that time, your time to be on the show on this occasion. And can you just give us a parting word of advice for those of us who want to get into these very, very intense and very kind of complicated at times chapters of history? Where do we go for the correct resources, or how should we approach the topic to begin with? Which sort of kind of resources should we begin looking into?
Good. Yeah. Okay. I mean, first of all, the first thing is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "La taqfu ma laysa laka bihi ilm." Yeah, don't we shouldn't speak, don't speak about which you have no knowledge, which means that we do need to kind of investigate further. And obviously, and as Imam al-Bukhari also mentioned, we need to have knowledge before speech and action. So if we want to speak about something, we need to have kind of the requisite knowledge of that thing. But in terms of, I think, I mean, this is a huge. I mean, I think I mentioned some sources for our discussion today, Ustad Ibrahim. I mean, I do. I think it's, I think maybe after we complete the these segments, we can probably look at kind of. I think that'd probably be. We can probably have a more holistic kind of comprehension of kind of materials which people could go through, I think.
Certainly.
Because I think today we've kind of mentioned a few of them.
Certainly. Well, thank you once again, inshallah. So about time for us to pray. And we look forward to seeing you again. It's been a very, very, very thought-provoking, very beneficial discussion. And again, thank you very much for taking that time to share your knowledge with us. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.